The smell of cherries and toasted almonds filled Nina Petrov's tiny bakery at 11:47 p.m., long after any sane baker should have gone home. She wasn't chasing a paycheck. She was chasing a pattern. Nina pressed the last strip of dough into place, and the lattice on top of her pie clicked into a perfect spiral. 8 strips over, 5 under, 3 across. Fibonacci numbers, hidden in pastry. Most customers never noticed. Nina noticed everything. Numbers had always made more sense to her than people did, ever since she was a lonely, overweight cow doing math problems under the covers with a flashlight while their parents fought in the next room. She was sliding the pie into the oven when headlights swept across the shop's front window. Not 1 car, 3. Black SUVs, engines still running, parked crooked across the narrow North End street like nobody had ever told the drivers about parking tickets, or like they simply didn't care. Nina's hand tightened on the oven mitt. The bell above the door rang, sharp and rude, and a man in a gray wool coat stepped inside without knocking. He was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the kind of exhausted, precise face that belonged to someone who hadn't slept properly in years. "You are Nina Petrov," he said. Not a question. "The shop's closed." "I know." He glanced past her at the ovens, at the cooling racks, at the pie she'd just put in. "My name is Dr. Aldrich Weiss. I need you to prepare a private meal tonight. Now. I will pay whatever you ask." Nina crossed her arms. "I don't do private catering at midnight for strange men who barge into locked shops." "You don't understand." For the first time, his composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but Nina saw it. Fear. Real fear. The kind doctors weren't supposed to show. "My patient hasn't eaten a full meal in 19 days. Not eaten, not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch, barely spoken a coherent sentence in weeks. I have tried every specialist, every neurologist in 3 states. Nothing works. Someone told him about your pies. He said your name in his sleep last night. The first full sentence he's spoken in a week was your name." Nina's irritation flickered into something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the old instinct that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a puzzle she couldn't yet see. "Who's your patient?" Before Weiss could answer, the door opened again. This time, 3 men filled the frame first, broad-shouldered, silent, scanning the shop like they expected an ambush in a bakery that smelled like cinnamon. Nina had grown up in a rough enough part of Boston to recognize muscle when she saw it. Her pulse spiked, but she planted her feet and didn't move an inch toward the back door. Then he walked in. He was tall, dressed in a black overcoat despite the warm August night, and he was shivering. Not dramatically, a small, constant tremor, like his body had forgotten how to hold still. His eyes were dark and unfocused, sliding across the shelves of pies without really seeing them. Handsome, in the way a statue is handsome, all sharp lines and no warmth underneath. "Victor?" Dr. Weiss said quietly. "This is Nina Petrov." Victor Morozov didn't answer. He walked past her to the cooling rack, where a cherry almond pie sat with its lattice crust catching the kitchen light. He stared at it the way a drowning man stares at a rope. "May I?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. Nina should have said no. Every instinct that had kept her safe in a city where men like this existed told her to say no. Instead, she found herself cutting a small slice and handing it to him on a chipped plate. Because some numbers you just have to test. Victor took a bite. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then his eyes changed. They sharpened, actually sharpened, like a camera lens snapping into focus. Color rushed into his gray face. His shivering stopped, all at once, replaced by a stillness that looked almost like relief. He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly, like a man surfacing after being underwater far too long. "What?" he said, opening his eyes. "Is in this?" "Terry's, almonds, butter, nothing special." Nina's heart was hammering, though she kept her voice flat. "That's not true." He looked at the crust again, at the precise mathematical weave of the lattice, tracing it with his eyes like he was reading a sentence. "I haven't felt warm in 2 years. I haven't felt anything in 2 years. Doctor, Weiss stepped forward, stunned. "Victor, your hands, they're not shaking." Victor looked down at his own steady fingers like they belonged to a stranger. Then he looked at Nina, and for the first time all night, someone actually saw her. Not the extra 30 pounds she carried, not the flour on her apron, not a chubby girl in a closing-time bakery. He saw the person who had just handed him something no doctor, no medication, no hospital had managed to give him in 2 years. "You're coming to work for me," he said, "starting tonight." "I have a shop to run." "I'll buy the building." He said it the way other men said, "I'll get the check." "Name a number, Miss Petrov. I don't care what it is." Nina should have laughed him out of her bakery. Instead, standing in the flour-dusted light at midnight, staring into the eyes of a stranger who had just come back to life over a slice of pie, she felt the pull of a much bigger, much more dangerous pattern. One she hadn't finished solving yet.
"One condition," she said. "You tell me what's actually wrong with you."
Victor's jaw tightened. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily, and Dr. Weiss suddenly found the floor very interesting. "Deal," Victor said. "Pack your things, Miss Petrov. We leave for Chicago tonight." Nina didn't know it yet, but she had just said yes to the most dangerous recipe of her life. The elevator ride to the top of Viktor Morozov's Chicago penthouse took 42 seconds. Nina counted them, because counting was easier than thinking about what she'd just done. She'd left her bakery, her whole life, for a stranger with tremors and a security detail. Her assistant, Marta, was already handling the shop's closure paperwork, paid a small fortune to keep quiet about where Nina had gone. Nina had told herself it was for the money. She knew, even then, that wasn't the whole truth. The penthouse doors opened onto a kitchen the size of her entire old shop. Brushed steel, white marble, a wall of glass overlooking Lake Michigan glittering 30 floors below. It was beautiful, the way a hospital is beautiful. Cold, sterile. Nobody had ever spilled flour on that marble. "This is unacceptable," Nina said, setting down her single suitcase. Victor, standing by the window in a fresh shirt, turned with the faint frown of a man unused to being told anything was unacceptable in a room he owned. "The appliances are top of the line, German, imported." "That's not the problem." Nina ran a hand along the counter. "A kitchen isn't a showroom, Mr. Morozov. It needs to breathe. It needs mess. Whatever fixed you last night, it wasn't the flour. It was care. You can't manufacture care with marble." Something shifted behind Victor's eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. "Then fix it. You have 4 days before the board dinner." By the second day, Nina had commandeered the space entirely. Mismatched copper pots hung from a hastily installed rack. Flour dusted the counters like snow. A radio in the corner played old jazz records low enough not to disturb the floor below. Victor's staff whispered about it, scandalized, but nobody dared say a word to him, because for the first time in 2 years, Viktor Morozov was eating 3 meals a day. Nina discovered quickly that his condition responded to specific things, complex, repeating visual patterns baked directly into pastry. Braided challah with 7-strand plaits, Fibonacci spirals in fruit tarts, geometric lattice work that, when she really looked at it, resembled something closer to code than decoration. Each time Victor ate one, The fog in his eyes thinned a little more. He spoke in longer sentences. He laughed, actually laughed, at something one of his men said over dinner on day 3, and the whole room went silent with shock, like they'd witnessed a statue sneeze. "Tell me about the accident," Nina said on the 4th night, during a late prep session that had crept toward 1 a.m. She was folding butter into dough for a peach galette, hands moving on instinct while she watched him from the corner of her eye. Victor sat on a stool at the island, sleeves rolled up, watching her work with the same intensity he probably once reserved for reading contracts. He didn't answer right away. "2 years ago," he finally said, "a rival organization tried to have me removed. Permanently. They failed to finish me. They didn't fail completely." He touched the back of his skull, just above his neck, where Nina now noticed a faint scar hidden in his hairline. "Traumatic brain injury. The doctors call it a disruption in, what did Weiss say, sensory pattern processing. I stopped being able to hold a coherent thought for more than a few minutes at a time. Food had no taste. Sleep brought no rest. I ran an empire through fog, Ms. Petrov, and I was very good at pretending the fog wasn't there." "And the pies help because—" "I don't know why they help." He looked up at her, and for a moment the mask of the syndicate boss fell away entirely, leaving something raw and almost boyish underneath. "I only know that when I look at your patterns, something in my head goes quiet, like a lock finally finding its key." Nina's hands stilled on the dough. She hadn't expected honesty. Men like Victor didn't usually hand a stranger the truth about their weaknesses, not unless they trusted her, or unless they'd stopped caring what happened if she used it against them. "I used to study cryptography," she admitted, surprising herself, "before the bakery. I loved patterns before I loved pie crust. Maybe that's why I bake the way I do. Old habits." "Cryptography." Victor repeated the word slowly, like he was turning it over, filing it away somewhere important. "A baker who breaks codes." "A baker who used to break codes," Nina corrected, sliding the galette into the oven a little too quickly. "Now I just break crusts." He laughed again, softer this time, real, and the sound did something strange to Nina's chest, something she hadn't felt in years and didn't have a tidy mathematical name for. They stood in comfortable silence while the galette baked, the kitchen smelling of peaches and browned butter, city lights scattered across the dark water outside like static on an old television. Victor reached over, almost absently, and brushed a streak of flour from Nina's cheek. His hand lingered half a second longer than it needed to. "You're not what I expected, Miss Petrov," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to ignore." Nina's pulse jumped, and she busied herself checking the oven timer to hide it. She told herself this was dangerous, that a man who ran an empire through violence and fear had no business making her heart race over pastry and flour-streaked cheeks. She told herself a dozen sensible things. None of them stopped her from smiling, just slightly, when Victor pulled 2 forks from the drawer and sat back down across from her to wait for the galette together, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Neither of them noticed, 30 floors below, a black car idling at the curb. Dmitry Sokolov, Victor's second in command, watching the glowing kitchen window with narrowed eyes, already calculating exactly how much this new softness in his boss was going to cost the organization. The phone rang at 2:14 a.m., and Nina knew before she answered that something was wrong. Nobody called at that hour with good news. "Nina." Elena's voice was thin, cracked, the kind of whisper that came from someone trying not to be overheard.
"Nina, I need you to listen to me and not panic."
Nina sat up in the guest suite Victor had given her, 3 rooms bigger than her old apartment, all of it still feeling borrowed, temporary.
"Elena, what's going on? Where are you?" "I'm okay. I'm safe. Physically, I mean.
A pause, and Nina heard something behind her sister's voice, muffled talking, a door closing, the particular quiet of a room where someone was trying very hard to sound calm.
I got into some trouble. Cards. There's a place in the South End, invite only, and I thought I was good enough to… Elena!
Nina's stomach dropped straight through the floor.
How much?
Silence.
Elena, how much do you owe? $150,000.
The number didn't make sense at first. Nina's brain, so good with numbers, so fluent in them, simply refused to process this one.
150,000.
Her sister was 24 years old, working part-time at a nail salon, living in a studio apartment with a roommate. There was no version of Eleanor's life that contained that number.
They're not letting me leave,
Eleanor whispered.
They call it house arrest. There are 2 guys outside my door at all times. They said I stay here until it's cleared, or until I give them something else instead.
Something else like what? Another silence, longer this time, and Nina understood without being told. Information. Leverage. Something valuable enough to trade for a debt that size. And Elena, panicked and desperate, had apparently mentioned exactly where her sister was staying and exactly who her sister was cooking for.
Elena, tell me you didn't say anything about Victor.
I didn't mean to. They were asking questions. They already knew things. I thought if I just… I'm sorry, Nina. I'm so sorry.
Nina closed her eyes, pressing her palm flat against the cool marble nightstand, forcing her breathing to slow the way she used to when a code refused to break. Panic was noise. Noise made you miss the pattern. She needed the pattern. "Okay," she said, steadier than she felt. "Okay, don't tell them anything else. Don't sign anything. I'm going to fix this."
How? Nina, 150,000.
I have savings. I'll figure out the rest. Just stay quiet, stay calm, and let me handle it. After she hung up, Nina sat in the dark for a long time, doing the math she already knew the answer to. Her savings, everything from 8 years of running the bakery, every dollar she'd ever put away for a rainy day, came to just under $40,000, not even a third of what Elena owed. She thought about waking Victor. The thought lasted exactly 4 seconds before she dismissed it. Victor had told her, over the peach galette, about the rival organization that had put a scar at the base of his skull. The Syndicate, the same underground network she now suspected that was holding her sister. If she told Victor the truth, he would act. He would send men, make calls, solve it the way men like him solved everything, with force, with threats, with consequences that could easily spiral into something far worse than a card debt. Elena could get hurt in the crossfire. Or worse, Victor might realize exactly how convenient it was that Nina, his cryptographer-turned-baker, had a direct personal connection to the very organization trying to push him out of his shipping routes. He might start to wonder if it was really a coincidence at all. No. She would handle this quietly, alone. The next afternoon, while Victor was locked in back-to-back calls with his shipping partners, Nina slipped out of the penthouse and took a rideshare to a wire transfer office 3 neighborhoods away, one Victor's people wouldn't think to watch. She sent her entire $40,000 to the account number Elena had texted her, hands shaking as she typed the confirmation. 2 hours later, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 40 isn't 150. Nice try. Your sister stays until it's cleared in full, or until you give us something worth more than money. We know exactly who you're cooking for, Ms. Petrov. Think about that. Nina stared at the screen until the words blurred. They knew her name. They knew where she was. And they were offering her a trade she would rather die than make. She thought about the casino's finances, about the fact that any organization running that kind of underground operation had to keep records somewhere. Digital records, encrypted, hidden, but not invisible. Not to someone who used to break codes for a living before she ever learned to braid dough. If she couldn't buy Elena's freedom, maybe she could earn it. Quietly, carefully, without Victor ever needing to know how close the fire had gotten to his door. That night, back in the penthouse, Nina baked until 3 a.m., an elaborate lattice tart with a pattern so intricate even Victor commented on it the next morning, turning the pastry slowly under the kitchen lights like he was reading a message meant only for him. "This one is different," he said. "I was thinking about something complicated," Nina said, which was true, and also nowhere near the whole truth. She didn't tell him that underneath her calm, competent hands, her mind was already sketching the shape of a backdoor code, the kind of digital thread that, if pulled correctly, might unravel an entire criminal casino's ledger from the inside. She didn't tell him that her sister's life now hung from that thread. And she definitely didn't tell him that 30 floors below, in a car parked just out of camera range, Dmitry Sokolov had just received a very interesting phone call of his own, one confirming that Nina Petrov had wired $40,000 to an account connected to the syndicate. He smiled and started building his file. Victor announced the trip the way he announced everything, as a decision already made, not a question waiting for an answer. "Pack for a week," he said, sliding a folder of shipping contracts aside like they'd suddenly stopped mattering. "Tahoe. No calls, no board meetings, no Dmitry."
You have a lake house.
"I have several houses. This one I actually like. A rare, unguarded smile. You've been baking miracles into my kitchen for 2 weeks straight, Ms. Petrov. I think it's time I returned the favor." Nina should have said no. Elena was still locked behind a door in the south end, with 2 men standing guard outside it, and every hour Nina spent away from her laptop, away from the casino's login portal she'd been quietly probing for 6 days, felt like an hour stolen from her sister's life. But saying no meant explaining why, and explaining why meant unraveling a lie she'd built too carefully to risk unspooling now. So she packed a bag, and she packed her laptop, hidden at the bottom, wrapped in a kitchen towel like contraband. The estate sat on the northern shore, wood and glass and snow-dusted pine even in late summer at that altitude. The kind of quiet that Boston never had. No traffic, no sirens, just water lapping against a private dock and mountains holding up a sky so clear it looked painted on. For the first 2 days, Nina almost let herself forget. Victor, without his empire, was a different man entirely. Not softer, exactly, but unguarded in a way that made Nina's chest ache to watch. He built a fire without being asked. He cooked breakfast, badly, and laughed at his own burnt eggs. He told her, over a bottle of wine on the second night, about growing up in a cramped Providence apartment before any of this, before the syndicate, before the scar at the base of his skull. A boy who'd once wanted to study astrophysics, before his father's debts pulled him into a very different kind of business. "I still remember the constellations," he admitted, staring up at the impossibly clear Tahoe sky. "Funny, the things the fog never touched." "What else did it never touch?" He looked at her for a long moment, firelight catching the sharp lines of his face, softening them into something almost young. "You," he said. "From the first bite of that pie. I don't understand it, but whatever part of me was still capable of feeling something, it recognized you immediately. Like my brain had been waiting for exactly this pattern its whole life." Nina's breath caught. She told herself it was the wine. She told herself a lot of things that week that weren't true. Later that night, standing on the dock under more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, Victor took her hand, carefully, like she might be something breakable, which was almost funny, considering everything she was hiding underneath her calm. He kissed her slowly, and Nina let herself feel it completely. Let herself forget the debt and the deadline and the message from an unknown number. for exactly as long as his mouth stayed on hers. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "Not just for the fog. For this."
Victor.
"I mean it, Nina. Whatever you need, whatever your future looks like, I want to be in it. I'll give you anything." Anything except knowing the truth right now, Nina thought, and hated herself for the thought. She didn't sleep that night. Long after Victor's breathing evened out beside her, Nina slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a blanket, and carried her laptop to the estate's small library, closing the door soft as a held breath. The casino system was old, an underground operation built by men who understood muscle far better than they understood firewalls. But it wasn't undefended. 6 days of probing had gotten her as far as the login gateway. Tonight, working by the glow of the screen alone, Nina finally found what she'd been hunting for: a maintenance back door, sloppily coded, the kind of shortcut a lazy developer builds and never bothers to close. It wasn't a straight line to Elena's freedom, but it was a thread, and Nina had always been good at threads. She worked until 4 a.m., mapping the shape of the casino's internal ledger architecture, careful never to trigger an alert, careful never to leave fingerprints that traced back to an IP address inside Viktor Morozov's private estate. Every keystroke felt like a betrayal of the man sleeping upstairs, not because she was hurting him, but because she was lying to him, actively, deliberately, in the very house where he'd just told her she was the one thing his broken brain had never lost. By the time she closed the laptop, dawn was starting to pink the mountains outside, and Nina understood something with sudden, sick clarity. This wasn't sustainable. She couldn't keep splitting herself in two, the woman falling in love with Viktor Morozov in the daylight, and the woman hacking his enemies in the dark, hoping desperately he never had to choose which version of her was real. She crept back into bed just as Victor stirred, reaching for her, half asleep, pulling her against his chest with the easy trust of a man who had no idea how much he was risking to protect him from a truth he didn't yet know existed. "Where'd you go?" he mumbled.
Couldn't sleep. Went to think.
"About what?" Nina pressed her forehead against his shoulder, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and last night's wine, and told the smallest lie of the entire tangled mess.
"About how good this feels,"
she said,
"and how scared I am of losing it."
That part, at least, was true. 200 miles away, in a Chicago office with the blinds drawn, Dmitry Sokolov spread 3 printed pages across his desk, timestamps, IP logs, a wire transfer record, and smiled the smile of a man who finally had everything he needed. The Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art had been rented out entirely for the evening, its white marble halls lit gold, string quartets tucked into corners playing for a crowd of men who'd made their fortunes in ways none of them discussed out loud. Victor moved through the gala like he owned the room, because in more ways than one, he did. Nina, in a deep emerald dress she still couldn't quite believe she'd let his stylist talk her into, stayed close to his side, more comfortable there than she wanted to admit. 3 weeks ago, she'd been flowering a counter in a North End bakery. Tonight, she was on the arm of a man half of Chicago's underworld feared, and somehow, impossibly, it felt less dangerous than the laptop hidden in her hotel room upstairs. "You look like you're calculating something," Victor murmured against her ear, handing her a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink.
"Just counting exits. Old habit."
"Cryptographer's instinct?"
"Something like that."
She smiled, and it wasn't entirely a lie. 2 nights ago, she'd cracked another layer of the casino's ledger architecture. She was close. Closer than she'd been in 3 weeks of quiet, careful work. Elena had texted that morning.
"Still okay. Still scared. Please hurry."
Nina had read it 4 times in the museum bathroom before fixing her makeup and rejoining the party like nothing was wrong. Across the room, Dmitry Sokolov watched them both, with the patient stillness of a man who'd already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. He found Victor alone 20 minutes later, near the wine cellar exhibit, away from the music and the crowd.
"A word," Dmitri said. "In private." Victor's jaw tightened. He knew that tone. "Make it quick."
Dmitri produced a slim folder from inside his jacket, the kind of gesture he'd clearly rehearsed.
"I wouldn't bring this to you unless I was certain. You know that about me."
Inside were 3 printed pages, a wire transfer record, $40,000 sent from an account under Nina Petrov's name to a number Dmitri identified with clinical precision as belonging to a shell company tied to the syndicate. An IP log, time-stamped from the Tahoe Estate's private network, showing repeated late-night access attempts against a server Dmitri claimed belonged to that same rival organization. And a photograph, grainy, clearly taken with a long lens, of Nina outside a wire transfer office 3 neighborhoods from the penthouse, glancing over her shoulder like a woman checking for a tail.
"She's been feeding them information since Chicago," Dmitri said quietly. "The wire transfer was payment for something. The late-night access is her covering her tracks, or worse, actively working for them from inside your own house. Victor, I know what she's done for your condition. I'm not blind to that. But ask yourself, a woman with a cryptography background just happens to fall into your life 2 weeks before Elena Petrov starts flashing cash at an underground casino run by our biggest competitor? That's not coincidence. That's a plant." Victor took the folder with hands that, for the first time in weeks, weren't entirely steady. He stared at the photograph the longest. Nina, looking over her shoulder, guilt written across her face even in a grainy long-lens shot. He thought about the nights she'd disappeared into the library at the lake house. He thought about how she'd tensed, just slightly, every time his phone buzzed with syndicate business. He thought about 100 small moments he'd been too fogged, too besotted, too grateful for the first real warmth in 2 years to properly examine.
"This is forged," he said, but it came out less certain than he wanted. "Have your own people verify it. I did." Dmitri's voice softened into something that might have almost passed for concern if Victor hadn't known him for 15 years. "I don't want to be right about this, Victor. I like her, honestly. She's fixed something in you nobody else could touch. But I would rather you hate me for showing you the truth than let her walk you straight into an ambush the way she's clearly setting up." Across the ballroom, oblivious, Nina laughed at something one of Victor's lieutenants said, her whole face lighting up in a way that had become, over the last 3 weeks, the single most reliable cure for whatever remained of Victor's fog.
He watched her from across the marble hall and felt something in his chest twist violently in 2 directions at once. The same fierce protectiveness he'd felt every night since the lake house, and a cold, creeping suspicion he hated himself for even entertaining. He didn't confront her that night. He told himself it was strategy. Better to watch her, gather more evidence, see if the pattern held before he acted rashly. He told himself a lot of things, walking back into the party with a face carefully arranged into nothing at all. But he canceled their driver and took a separate car home. He told Nina he had late calls to make and locked himself in his study instead, staring at the 3 printed pages until the words blurred, running the timeline over and over in his mind. $40,000. Wired the same week her sister supposedly vanished from any conversation Nina had with him. Late-night access logs from his own private network. A woman who used to break codes for a living, now sleeping 15 feet from his most sensitive financial systems. He thought about the scar at the base of his skull, put there 2 years ago by an organization that wanted him gone. An organization Dmitri swore, with documentation to back it, that Nina Petrov was secretly working for. For the first time since the night she'd handed him a slice of cherry almond pie in a closing bakery, Viktor Morozov looked at Nina and felt something he hadn't felt toward her once. Doubt. Upstairs,
Unaware her whole world was about to tilt sideways, Nina was on the phone with Elena in a quiet corner of the museum's coat check, whispering, "2 more days. I'm so close. Just hold on 2 more days." With absolutely no idea that 2 floors below, the ground beneath her had already started to crack. They flew back to Tahoe the next morning, and Nina knew immediately something had shifted. Victor didn't take her hand in the car. He didn't ask about her flight, didn't tease her about the paperback she'd brought to read, didn't do any of the small, easy things that had become the rhythm of the last 3 weeks. He sat across from her with the folder closed on his lap, and his eyes had gone flat and unreadable, the way they must have looked to men across a negotiating table. "Victor, what's wrong?" "We'll talk at the house." The estate felt different when they arrived, colder despite the mountain sun. 2 of Victor's men stood at the door instead of the usual one, and Nina's stomach dropped straight through the floor of the entryway when she saw them exchange a look with Victor as he walked past. He led her into the kitchen, her kitchen, the space she'd filled with mismatched pots and flour dust and jazz records over the past 3 weeks, and set the folder down on the marble island between them, like a verdict already reached. "Explain this." Nina opened it with hands that had gone numb. The wire transfer, the IP logs, the photograph outside the money transfer office. She felt the blood leave her face in one long, cold wave.
Victor, this isn't…
$40,000, Nina. Wired to an account tied to the syndicate. The same organization that put a scar on the back of my skull. The same organization trying to strangle my shipping routes out from under me. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. And late-night access attempts against a rival server from inside my own house while I was asleep 15 feet away, thinking you were the safest thing that had happened to me in 2 years.
I can explain everything.
Then explain. So she did. All of it. Elena, 24 and desperate and drowning in a debt that made no sense for a nail salon employee. The house arrest. The threats. The $40,000 that hadn't been nearly enough, sent quietly because Nina had been terrified of exactly this moment. Victor's face closing like a door. Victor's men suddenly treating her like a threat, instead of the woman who'd been baking his fog away every single night. She told him about the backdoor code she'd been chasing for 3 weeks, the ledger architecture she was one step from cracking, the plan to buy Elena's freedom with information instead of money she didn't have.
I wasn't spying on you, Nina said, voice breaking. I was trying to save my sister without dragging you into a war. With the people who already tried to finish you once. I thought I was protecting you.
Victor said nothing for a long, terrible moment. Nina watched him war with himself, watched the man who'd kissed her on a dock under 1,000 stars fight against the man who'd built an empire by never trusting anyone completely. "I want to believe you," he finally said. "I do, but I have a council that will vote to remove me if they think I've let a syndicate plant into my inner circle, and Dmitri already has this file circulating. I need to verify every word of what you just told me before I can act. Until then..." He stopped, and Nina saw genuine pain cross his face. "Until then, I need you to stay here, in the kitchen, under guard. Not because I think you're guilty, because if I'm wrong about you, and my council finds out I let you walk free while unverified, they won't just move against you. They'll move against me."
You're locking me in?
"I'm protecting you from people who will not ask questions the way I just did." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "Give me 48 hours, Nina. Please." The door closed. Nina heard the lock turn from the outside, and for the first time since the pie shop, she let herself cry. Not from fear, but from the specific, awful grief of being disbelieved by the one person she'd let herself trust completely. She didn't know how long she sat on the kitchen floor before she noticed the small intercom panel beside the pantry door, a relic of the estate's original security system, still wired to the hallway outside. She pressed the button.
Victor, are you there?
A long pause.
Then, quietly, I'm here. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to actually hear it this time.
Nina pressed her palm flat against the cold steel door, as if she could reach through it.
My pastry patterns aren't decoration, Victor. They're mathematical sequences, Fibonacci spirals, prime-based braiding, geometric ratios I learned studying cryptography before I ever touched flour. I didn't choose them randomly. Something about that specific kind of complex, repeating structure rewires damaged neural pathways. It's called pattern therapy. Real, documented, used in some trauma recovery programs, just never through food. I've been healing your brain injury with math, disguised as pie, since the night we met. And I never told you, because I didn't fully understand it myself until I watched it work on you, day after day, and started reading everything I could find. Silence on the other side of the door.
Then, why are you telling me this now? Because you're locking me in a kitchen out of fear, and I want the last thing you know about me, if this goes wrong, to be the truth. All of it, not just the parts that make me look guilty.
She heard something on the other side of the door that might have been Victor sitting down against it, sliding to the floor the way she had.
I don't want to believe you're capable of betraying me, he said quietly. And I hate that I even have to consider it.
Then don't consider it. Verify it. Call whoever you need to call. Send someone to that casino, but Victor... Her voice broke again. While you're doing that, my sister is still locked in a room in Boston. And every hour you spend deciding whether to trust me is an hour she's still in danger. The intercom went quiet.
Nina pressed her forehead against the cold door and waited, the kitchen full of half-finished pastry and the ghost of every warm night that had led her here, hoping desperately that the man on the other side still remembered how it felt to come back to life over a slice of pie. Victor left for Boston at dawn, alone except for two of his most trusted men, telling no one at the estate except Dr. Weiss where he was really going. He needed to see the casino himself. He needed to see Elena Petrov with his own eyes, hear her story before Nina's, unfiltered by love or by loyalty. It was the only way he knew to be fair to both of them. He didn't know that by leaving Chicago, he'd handed Dmitry Sokolov exactly the window he'd been waiting 15 years to open. Dmitry moved the moment Victor's plane left the ground. He'd spent the better part of a decade quietly cultivating access he was never supposed to have. A junior systems administrator here, a bribed security contractor there, small compromises that meant nothing individually and everything together. By the time Victor's plane touched down in Boston, Dmitry had already triggered a full master key rotation on Victor's private digital vault, the encrypted mainframe that held everything: shipping manifests, financial accounts, the syndicate's most sensitive records, the leverage that kept 11 council members loyal instead of ambitious. He called an emergency session of the council before noon. Viktor Morozov left the organization exposed, Dmitry told the assembled men, voice grave with rehearsed concern. He flew across the country chasing a woman with a documented connection to the syndicate, and in his absence, I discovered irregularities in the vault security that suggested active tampering. I acted to protect this organization the only way I could. I locked it down. Full stop. Until we can be certain Victor himself hasn't been compromised. It was, of course, a lie wrapped around a half-truth, wrapped around an act of naked ambition. But Dmitry had learned long ago that the best coups never look like coups. They look like caution. The council, rattled and half-convinced, agreed to an emergency vote at midnight, a vote on whether Viktor Morozov, weakened by injury, distracted by a woman under active suspicion, and now locked out of his own systems,
remained fit to lead.
Victor found out 3 hours later, standing in a rundown South End building that smelled of cigarette smoke and old carpet, having just laid eyes on Elena Petrov for the first time. 24 years old, hollow-eyed, guarded by two bored men who straightened the moment they recognized who'd walked in. Elena's story matched Nina's, detail for detail, down to the exact wording of the threat text Nina had shown him a photo of days earlier at the estate. His phone buzzed mid-conversation. A terse message from one of his few remaining loyal lieutenants in Chicago. Vault locked. Dmitri called emergency council vote. Midnight. Get back now. Victor read it twice, and something in his chest went cold and clear all at once. The specific, focused clarity that came, ironically, from the one thing that had never failed to work on his fog. Pure, undiluted fury. He'd been so consumed by Dmitri's file, so busy verifying whether the woman who healed him was capable of betraying him, that he'd handed the actual traitor a 3-day head start. He turned to Elena. "Your sister told the truth, all of it. I'm sorry for what you've been through, and I promise you, this will be over soon." Then, to the casino manager hovering nervously near the door, "This debt isn't finished between us, but right now, I have a different fire to put out." He was on a plane back to Chicago within the hour, and the moment his wheels touched down, his own people confirmed the worst of it. The vault's encryption had been rewritten using a multi-layered algorithm Dmitri had clearly spent months preparing. Victor's own security team, competent, loyal, but never built for this, couldn't break it. Every financial account, every shipping route, every piece of leverage that kept his organization functioning was frozen behind a lock only its architect could open. Midnight was 6 hours away. If the vault stayed locked, if Victor couldn't prove he still controlled his own empire, the council would vote him out. And Dmitri, conveniently positioned as the man who'd protected the organization during a crisis, would be waiting to take his place. Victor thought of exactly one person on Earth who might crack a multi-layered encryption algorithm in 6 hours. He called the estate. The guard outside the kitchen answered. "Get her a laptop and the secure line. Now." "Sir, she's still confined, you said." "I said get her a laptop and the secure line. And if anything happens to her while I'm not there, you'll answer to me personally." Victor's voice cracked like a whip, and the guard didn't argue again. Nina picked up the call sitting on the kitchen floor, where she'd spent most of the last day, eyes red, exhausted, still locked behind a door she hadn't heard open again since the intercom conversation. "Victor, I need your help." He said it plainly, without preamble, without apology, yet there would be time for that later, if there was a later at all. "Dimitri's staged a coup. He's locked me out of my own vault with an encryption algorithm none of my people can break, and the council votes at midnight on whether to remove me. If they vote yes, Nina, everything Elena went through, everything you did to save her, none of it matters. Because Dmitri will run this organization without a shred of mercy for either of you." Nina was already on her feet, laptop bag in hand, mind clicking into the cold, focused calculation she'd spent 3 weeks trying to keep separate from the woman who baked pies and fell in love against her own better judgment. "Send me everything you have on the lockdown," she said. "Every log, every timestamp, every scrap of data your people pulled before they got locked out. I need to see the shape of what he built." "You believe I trust you again?" "I believe you need me to save your life in the next 6 hours," Nina said, already opening her laptop. "And that we can have the rest of this conversation once your empire isn't on fire." For the first time in 2 days, Victor almost laughed. "Fair enough, Ms. Petrov. 6 hours. Don't disappoint me." "I never have," Nina said, and started typing. The data came through in pieces,
Screenshots of error logs, fragments of the vault's rejected login attempts, a partial capture of the encryption handshake one of Victor's engineers had managed to intercept before Dimitri's lockdown fully closed the door.
Nina spread it all across the kitchen island, like ingredients for a recipe nobody else could read. And for the first time in 3 weeks, nobody in the house tried to stop her from working exactly the way she needed to. The guard who'd locked her in that morning now stood outside with the door wide open, watching her with something between suspicion and awe. Nina studied the encryption handshake for 20 minutes before the first problem became clear. This wasn't ordinary software encryption. Dimitri, whatever his moral failings, was clever. He'd built a 256-bit key using a custom algorithm layered with irregular, non-repeating mathematical noise designed specifically to defeat brute-force decryption software. Standard cracking tools would take weeks, maybe months, throwing random combinations at a lock built to laugh at randomness. Nina didn't have weeks. She had 5 hours and 40 minutes. She closed her laptop and stared instead at her own hands. "What are you doing?" the guard asked, watching her push the laptop aside and reach for a mixing bowl instead.
"Thinking with my fingers," Nina said, which sounded insane out loud, but she'd learned years ago that some patterns lived in her hands before they ever reached her conscious mind. Standard software treated encryption keys as abstract numbers. Nina had never once in her entire life understood numbers as purely abstract. She understood them as shapes, as braids, as lattices and spirals, and the specific tension of dough pulled tight enough to hold a pattern without tearing. She pulled up the partial handshake data on her laptop screen and started translating it, not into more code, but into physical geometry. The encryption's irregular noise pattern, when she mapped its numeric intervals onto a spatial grid instead of a linear string, revealed something almost like a weave. 12 distinct value clusters.
Non-repeating, but not random. Irregular in a way that followed its own internal logic, the way a badly kept secret still follows the shape of the person keeping it.
"I need 12-strand sourdough," Nina said, already pulling flour from the pantry. "And I need it now."
The guard blinked.
"You're going to bake your way through a cyber attack?"
"I'm going to use the one thing I understand better than any computer does."
Nina was already mixing, hands moving fast, muscle memory taking over while her mind mapped numbers onto strands.
"Software sees this key as a string of characters. I see it as a physical structure. If I braid the actual value clusters into dough, 12 strands weighted and positioned according to their numeric relationships, I can see where the pattern breaks down, where Dimitri's irregular noise actually has a seam. Every custom cipher has one, because no human being, no matter how clever, builds something with truly zero structure. There's always a seam. I just need to find it with my hands instead of a screen."
For the next 3 hours, Nina worked the way she'd worked her entire life before any of this. Victor, the syndicate.
The pie shop raid that felt a lifetime ago, completely absorbed, half in the kitchen and half somewhere deep inside a mathematical structure only she could see. She braided, unbraided, adjusted the weight and position of each strand according to the value clusters from the encryption handshake, watching for the moment the pattern would resist her, the moment a strand refused to sit naturally against its neighbors. She found the seam at 11:02 p.m. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, a single cluster of values that, when she tried to braid it into the pattern the way its neighbors demanded, simply didn't fit. The dough bunched wrong, the tension pulled crooked. Dimitri had built 11 clusters with genuine mathematical irregularity, and one cluster, probably rushed, probably built under time pressure the same way she was working now, that followed a much simpler, more predictable sequence underneath. That was the flaw. That was the door. Nina photographed the braid from 4 angles, translated the physical geometry back into numeric sequence,
and spent the next 40 minutes running the resulting values against the partial handshake data, refining, testing, refining again. At 11:51 p.m., 9 minutes before the council vote, her screen returned a single line of text she'd been chasing for 3 weeks and 3 hours combined. Decryption key valid. Vault access restored. Nina called Victor before she'd even finished reading the confirmation. Twice.
I have it,
She said, breathless, flour still dusted across her knuckles.
I'm sending you the sequence now. Victor, feed it in exactly as I send it. The order matters. There's no room for error.
Sending it. His voice was tight, controlled, a man standing in front of a room full of council members who thought his empire had already slipped through his fingers. Nina, if this doesn't work...
It'll work. Type it.
She heard him relay the sequence to someone in the room, heard the click of keys, heard a silence stretch out long enough that Nina's own heart nearly stopped in sympathy. Then, distantly through the phone, a system chime, a murmur of shocked voices, and Victor's voice, low and fierce and unmistakably alive, cutting through all of it. Vaults open, full access restored, every account, every route, everything, mine again. A pause, and when he spoke next, it wasn't to the council anymore. It was to her.
Nina, you just saved my entire life's work with a loaf of bread.
12-strand sourdough, Nina corrected, laughing and crying at once, sliding down against the kitchen counter with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd just spent 3 hours fighting a war with her hands instead of a weapon. Don't undersell the recipe. Behind Victor, she could hear the council's murmur shifting from shock into something closer to reluctant respect. And somewhere in that room, she knew, Dmitry Sokolov was watching his midnight coup collapse in real time, undone not by force, not by violence, but by a woman he'd tried to frame as a traitor, using nothing but flour, math, and the 12 strands of a braid he'd never seen coming. Victor didn't sleep that night. By the time the council session ended, a unanimous vote to reaffirm his leadership, several members openly apologizing for ever entertaining Dmitry's version of events. It was nearly 3 a.m., and he was already on a plane back to Tahoe, restless in a way that had nothing to do with his old brain fog, and everything to do with the woman waiting for him there. He found Nina asleep at the kitchen island, head resting on her folded arms beside a laptop still open to the vault's restored dashboard, flour dried into the creases of her knuckles. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her breathe, unguarded and exhausted, and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a clean enough word for. Gratitude wasn't big enough. Neither was love, not entirely, though it was closer.
He woke her gently. "Get dressed," he said. "We're going to Boston."
Victor, it's the middle of the night.
Your sister has been locked in a room for over a month because of a debt she never should have owed, and I am done letting other people's clocks decide when I act. He kissed her forehead, careful and certain in a way he hadn't quite managed before the vault, before the intercom, before he'd nearly lost everything and had it handed back to him by a woman with flour on her hands. We end this today. They landed in Boston by mid-morning, and this time, Victor didn't come as a curious outsider verifying a story. He came as exactly what he was, the head of an organization the underground casino's management had spent months trying, unsuccessfully, to push out of the city's shipping lanes. The South End building looked smaller in daylight, shabbier, the kind of place that survived on intimidation rather than genuine strength. Victor walked in with 4 men behind him and Nina at his side, and the casino's floor manager, a heavyset man named Kostas who'd built his whole reputation on never looking rattled, went visibly pale the moment he recognized who'd just entered his building uninvited.
"Mr. Morozov, we didn't expect... I'm sure you didn't."
Victor's voice was calm, almost pleasant, which made it somehow more menacing than shouting would have.
Elena Petrov. Bring her out. Now. She has an outstanding debt. She has a debt to an organization that has spent the last several months running crooked tables, skimming from its own high rollers, and laundering shipping insurance fraud through 3 shell companies I now have complete documentation on. Victor set a folder on the counter, thin but devastating, built from the same casino ledger architecture Nina had spent weeks quietly mapping in the dark, back when she thought she was working entirely alone. My associate is a rather gifted cryptographer, Kostas. She's been inside your systems for over a month. I know exactly how much money you've been skimming off your own bosses, and exactly how unhappy they'll be to learn about it. Kostas's composure cracked.
You can't prove. I can prove all of it, Nina said quietly, stepping forward for the first time. Timestamps, account numbers, the back door your developer never bothered to close, the one I've been living inside for a month, watching every crooked transaction you thought nobody would ever find. I have copies stored in 3 places you'll never locate. So here's the arrangement, Kostas. You wipe my sister's debt, the full 150,000, gone, cleared, done. And this evidence stays exactly where it is. Or Mr. Morozov's people share it with the people you actually answer to, and you can explain to them, personally, why their money's been disappearing into your pocket for the last 18 months. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nina could hear her own pulse in her ears.
Then Kostas, jaw tight with fury he had no room to express, nodded once to a man by the back door. Elena emerged 3 minutes later, thinner than Nina remembered, dark circles under her eyes, but alive, unhurt, blinking against the daylight like someone stepping out of a month-long night. The moment she saw Nina, she broke, crossing the room at a run, and Nina caught her, both of them crying openly in the middle of a casino floor that had held her sister hostage for 36 days.
I'm so sorry,
Elena sobbed into her shoulder.
I'm so sorry, Nina. I never should have. I put you in danger. I put everyone in danger. You're safe now. That's all that matters. Nina held her sister tight, feeling weeks of fear finally start to loosen its grip on her chest. We're going home. Victor watched the reunion from a few feet away, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Not jealousy, not impatience, but a kind of quiet reverence for a bond he'd never really had a chance to build with anyone in his own life. When Elena finally pulled back, wiping her face, she looked at him with a wariness that made sense given everything she'd been told about men like him. You're the Mafia boss my sister's been risking her life to protect, Elena said, half question, half accusation.
I'm the man your sister saved twice, Victor corrected gently. Once with a pie, once with a loaf of bread. I owe her considerably more than a debt cleared.
Kostas signed the release paperwork with visible reluctance, formally erasing the $150,000 from whatever ledger it had ever existed on, and Victor's men escorted the 3 of them out of the building and into the daylight, where a car was already waiting. As they pulled away from the curb, Elena curled against her sister's shoulder in the back seat, finally letting herself cry the kind of exhausted, relieved tears she'd been holding back for over a month. Nina held her the entire ride, one hand laced through Victor's across the seat, and for the first time since a stranger in a gray wool coat had barged into her bakery at midnight, she let herself believe that maybe, impossibly, everything was actually going to be okay.
But back in Chicago, Dmitry Sokolov, stripped of his midnight victory, humiliated in front of the council, and now facing the very real possibility that Victor's restored access to the vault meant Victor's restored access to every embezzled dollar Dmitry had quietly siphoned for himself over 15 years, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. And he still had one card left to play. Dmitry's last card arrived in the form of an anonymous tip to 3 council members sent at 2 a.m. the night before Victor's return to Chicago.
A claim that Nina Petrov's cryptography access to the vault during the crisis had been a deliberate move, engineered from the start, to plant permanent backdoor surveillance inside Victor's most sensitive systems. It was a desperate play, built on nothing but suspicion and Dmitri's remaining credibility. But desperate men didn't need good cards. They only needed enough doubt to buy themselves one more round. It almost worked. 2 of the 3 council members Dmitri contacted requested an emergency audit before Victor's leadership could be considered fully secure again. Victor granted it without hesitation. "Audit everything," he told the room of assembled council members 2 days later, back in the same Chicago boardroom where Dmitri had staged his coup a week earlier. "Every account, every transaction, every access log, going back not 1 week, but 5 years. I want this organization's finances examined so thoroughly that no one in this room ever has to wonder again who's been loyal and who's been lying." It was, Nina realized watching from the corner of the room, a brilliant move. Not defensive, but offensive. Victor wasn't protecting himself from scrutiny, he was inviting it, because he knew, with the calm certainty of a man who trusted the woman beside him completely, exactly what a 5-year audit would actually uncover. Nina spent the next 3 days buried in financial records instead of pastry dough, running the same pattern recognition instincts that had cracked Dmitri's encryption key against 15 years of shell company filings, offshore transfers, and quietly misreported shipping invoices. What she found wasn't just recent embezzlement. It went back much further than anyone in that boardroom expected. "Victor," she said quietly on the 3rd night, spreading printouts across his desk with hands that had gone cold despite the warm office. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to sit down first." He didn't sit. He never did when she asked him to, but he read. 2 years ago, the night an assassination attempt had left Victor with a traumatic brain injury and a scar at the base of his skull, the organization's official story had always pointed outward, a rival syndicate, an external enemy trying to seize his shipping routes. Nina's audit told a different story. A wire transfer, routed through 4 shell companies to obscure its origin, had paid a significant sum to an outside contractor exactly 9 days before the attack. The transfer originated from an account Dmitry Sokolov controlled personally, disguised inside a routine equipment purchase order that had gone unquestioned for 2 years because no one had ever thought to look at it twice. "He didn't just try to remove you now," Nina said softly. "Victor, I think Dmitri orchestrated the attack that hurt you 2 years ago. I think the rival syndicate was never the real threat. I think it was always him, patiently waiting for either the injury to finish what the attack started, or for you to finally trust him enough to hand over full control." Victor read the transfer record 3 times, his face going through something Nina had never seen on him before. Not fury, not yet, but a kind of devastated recalculation, like a man discovering the floor he'd been standing on for 15 years had never been solid at all. "He's been my second since I was 26 years old," Victor said quietly. "I trusted him with everything." "I know." "He watched me struggle for 2 years, watched me lose whole days to fog I couldn't explain to anyone. And the entire time, he knew exactly why. Because he'd caused it." Victor's hands flattened against the desk, knuckles white. "And when I finally started healing, when you finally gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone for good, he tried to frame you as a traitor rather than risk me getting strong enough to look too closely at his books." The council convened the following morning, and this time, Victor didn't need to argue his own credibility. He simply laid the 5-year audit across the table, letting the numbers speak in the language every council member in that room understood far better than loyalty or suspicion ever could. Money. Moved carefully, deliberately, for 15 years, from accounts that were never supposed to bleed. Dmitri, called before the council to answer for the discrepancies, tried denial first, then indignation, then When the wire transfer from 2 years ago was placed in front of him alongside a shipping invoice he'd personally signed to disguise it, a long, brittle silence that told the room everything his words no longer could.
"You could have simply asked to be paid more," Victor said quietly, and something about the calm in his voice was far more damning than rage would have been. "You could have come to me directly, at any point in 15 years, with any grievance you had. Instead, you had me shot. You let me live with 2 years of fog, rather than risk me recovering enough to notice what you'd built underneath me." "You were never going to see it," Dmitri said finally, bitterness cracking through. "You were too busy falling in love with a baker to notice your own organization rotting from the inside." "No," Victor said. "I noticed everything, eventually, because she taught me how to see clearly again."
The council's vote to strip Dmitri of rank and remove him from the organization entirely was unanimous, and this time it came with something Victor's world rarely offered: formal cooperation with federal fraud investigators, a complete financial paper trail handed over without hesitation, because Viktor Morozov had decided, standing in that boardroom with Nina's audit spread across the table, exactly what kind of future he wanted to build going forward. "I'm restructuring," he told the council, once Dmitri had been escorted out under guard. "Every illegal operation this organization runs, gone within 18 months. Shipping, logistics, warehousing, legitimate, fully licensed, fully legal. I nearly lost my mind, my empire, and the only woman who's ever actually seen me clearly, all because I built my life on foundations I never questioned closely enough. That ends now." Nina, standing quietly at the back of the room, felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something closer to the specific satisfaction of watching a pattern finally resolve itself completely. Every loose thread accounted for, every hidden variable finally exposed to the light.
6 weeks after a stranger in a gray wool coat had barged into a closing bakery in the North End,
Nina Petrov stood in the same neighborhood, a few blocks from her old shop, staring up at a storefront that hadn't existed the last time she'd walked this street. The sign above the door read Petrov and Morozov, the letters cut into brushed brass, and underneath, in smaller script, Bakery of Patterns. "You're doing the thing again," Elena said, nudging her sister's shoulder. "The staring at numbers thing. It's grand opening day, Nina. You're allowed to just be happy about it." Elena looked nothing like the hollow-eyed woman who'd walked out of a South End casino 10 weeks earlier. She'd spent the time since rebuilding. Real therapy, not just promises, and a job she'd asked for herself, working the front counter and register instead of accepting money she hadn't earned. Victor had offered her a position out of guilt at first. Elena had turned it into something real by refusing to let it stay charity. Inside, the bakery hummed with the particular chaos of an opening morning. Marta, Nina's old assistant, coordinating the pastry case with military precision. 2 new hires Nina had personally trained, learning the specific tension required for a proper Fibonacci lattice. The smell of butter and cherries and fresh bread rolling out the open door and down Beacon Hill's narrow, elegant street. And behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across his forearms, stood Viktor Morozov. No security detail flanking him, no black SUVs idling outside, just a man in an apron, laughing at something Elena said, steady-handed and clear-eyed in a way that had nothing to do with pastry anymore and everything to do with genuinely healed. He'd kept his promise to the council. 8 weeks in, the restructuring was already well underway. Shipping routes renegotiated under full legal licensing, warehousing contracts rewritten from the ground up, illegal operations wound down one by one under the quiet, careful supervision of federal investigators who'd been remarkably cooperative once Victor handed them Dimitri's 15-year paper trail on a silver platter. It wasn't finished. Empires that size didn't unmake themselves overnight, but it was real, and it was moving in exactly one direction, forward, toward a version of himself he'd apparently been trying to become since long before he'd ever tasted a slice of cherry almond pie.
"Nervous?" Victor asked, coming up behind Nina and resting his chin lightly against her shoulder, watching the morning's first customers start to gather outside the door.
Terrified,
Nina admitted.
This is real, in a way the penthouse kitchen never quite was. If people hate the pastries here, there's no syndicate money to fall back on.
They won't hate them.
He turned her gently by the shoulders to face him, and for a moment the bakery noise faded into something soft and private, the way it always seemed to when he looked at her like that.
"I haven't had a single foggy morning in 6 weeks, Nina. Not one.
Do you understand what that means? After 2 years of losing entire days to a fog I couldn't explain or escape. You didn't just save my empire. You gave me my mind back. There isn't a pastry case in the world that could fail with that kind of proof standing behind the counter. That's not how bakeries work."
"Humor me," Victor said, and kissed her, unhurried, unguarded, the kind of kiss that no longer needed a locked door or a hidden dock under 1,000 stars to feel safe. The morning rush arrived in earnest an hour later. Curious neighbors, old regulars from Nina's original shop who'd tracked down her new address through word of mouth, a small write-up in a local paper that had somehow gotten wind of the reclusive shipping magnate-turned-baker angle and couldn't resist the story. Nina moved through it all in a kind of joyful blur, hands finding their old rhythm on new counters, watching Victor charm customers at the register with an ease she never would have believed possible the night she'd first seen him shivering in her old kitchen. By early afternoon, the crowd had thinned to a manageable hum, and Victor caught her hand, pulling her gently toward the small back kitchen, private, quiet, still smelling faintly of the cherry almond test batch she'd baked that morning for luck. "I have something for you," he said. 2 things, actually. The first was a folded document, thick with legal language Nina skimmed twice before the meaning fully landed. The deed to the building, transferred entirely into her name. Not shared ownership, not a gift with strings attached. Hers, completely, free and clear.
"Victor, this is too much."
"It's exactly enough," he said. "You built something out of nothing twice in your life. Once on Hanover Street with flour and stubbornness. Once inside my vault with math and a loaf of bread. I want you to own the ground you're standing on this time. No landlord, no investor, no syndicate boss who could theoretically take it back. Yours." Before Nina could fully process it, he was down on one knee on the flour-dusted floor of the kitchen, pulling a small velvet box from his apron pocket with hands that, for once in his life, actually shook a little.
"The second thing," he said, "is a question I've been trying to ask for 6 weeks and kept losing my nerve. Which, considering everything I've survived, is genuinely embarrassing." Nina laughed through sudden tears, one hand pressed against her mouth. "Nina Petrov, you walked into my life with a pie and walked out with my entire future rearranged around you. You saved me from a fog I thought I'd die inside of. You saved your sister with nothing but your own 2 hands. You saved my empire with a loaf of bread nobody else on earth would have thought to bake. I don't have anything left to offer you that you haven't already earned twice over. Except this. Marry me. Build the rest of this with me. Let me spend however many years I have left proving I was worth all of it." Outside, the bakery's afternoon customers went on about their day, unaware that in the kitchen behind the counter, a former Mafia boss and the baker who'd rewired his broken mind were sealing the strangest, most improbable partnership either of them had ever calculated.
one that had never, not for a single moment, needed math to prove it was exactly right. Nina said yes before he'd even finished opening the box.